Hello everyone, and this is a little literature-related stream that I organize. It's about the recent interesting books of weird fiction and the many different subgenres of this big sort of genre. And I will also, meanwhile, to get the thinking going better, I'm gonna play some music sometimes. Because I got very much hooked on some jazz stuff unexpectedly. So, and then we're gonna talk about some books, of course. And the first kind of big topic that we're going to tackle is an interesting topic that is entertained and scrutinized in weird fiction books, is the idea of an octopus. An octopus as an interesting creature, as a strange and very weird natural phenomenon and an animal of different talents and possibilities that are not present with other animals of this size, let's say. And so people have been, in literature at least, have been very much fascinated with the idea of an entity, a creature that lives in the same, as we would say, biosynosis with humans, basically occupying the same planet, but they might be so insanely high in terms of their intellect that we only register only half of what they do. The other half, or even the bigger half of what they actually do, those creatures that would be so much more talented than human beings, that they do stuff that we just cannot register because of the hardware not allowing, or not specifically set up to register those kinds of signals and events. And so this kind of topic is very interesting in literature, especially in the recent, let's say, 100 years. Starting from Herbert Wells, who explored the ideas of a different kind of consciousness, which thinks differently, which can do much more, which can create so not only occupy worlds where we are, let's say, our human experience, but they can create such worlds. And so these kind of animals have been around in weird fiction, in literature that tries to defy genres, that mixes together different elements of unsettling ideas that are not necessarily pleasant or satisfying even to scrutinize. And that's what these kinds of books do, essentially. And so the first book that I would recommend from the modern kind of very top of the shelf fiction is by Jeremy Robert Johnson. It's been released only recently, I guess it's 2022, and I've read Jeremy Robert Johnson's previous work. His novel Skullcrack City, I almost finished it because I often get distracted by other books, and I might finish a different book before I finish this one. Plus, I also like to take unexpected pauses in reading a book just to savor it a little bit. So even if it's a very page-turning part of the book that really lends itself, to read, I would stop, just make a bookmark, stop and, ruminate on what I've read for a while, for a couple of weeks sometimes. Sometimes it's getting even longer, into months. And so that's what happened with some books. And Jeremy Robert Johnson's collection, Entropy in Bloom, and his novel Skullcrack City, I've read over a number of years. But I finished just recently the short story collection, and he is heart-gripping and heartbreaking often, and very experimental and very talented with words. So this is not only top shelf weird fiction or sci-fi in terms of the magnitude of ideas in the book, but you're also quite humbled by the sheer talent and the hard work that the writer is putting into his prose. So Jeremy Robert Johnson is a must-read for any fan of, really gripping literature, serious literature in terms of prose, and also challenging in terms of ideas. So The Loop is his latest novel, and it's about the idea of mind control and the actual technologies of mind control. The idea of an octopus is somewhat present there without any spoilers, but it's not what you might expect if somebody would say like octopus or even marine fauna, marine animal life. You wouldn't put it in a book and cover like this. You can see it doesn't show that anywhere in this book there's an octopus, but then who knows, So it's a very gripping and entertaining book. It's a rescue. Literature like this is a rescue for you if you are genuinely bored with what, let's say, the movie industry is doing, or just bored by how run-of-the-mill stuff has become in, let's say, video culture. It's harder and harder to get something prominent noticed or even promoted, and so you have to sift through a lot. So Jeremy Robert Johnson is the book that you sift through for. You're looking for this kind of literature. And so closer to the topic of mind controlled by a different entity. What's interesting about the Jeremy Robert Johnson's novel The Loop, it is also about identity of what being human being really is in the whole, fabric of creation. It goes that deep. So it's an existential novel about a lot to unpack there if you really, if you're a real reader who likes to dwell on things after they read stuff. So this is the kind of novel that gets you into thinking mode about different concepts therein, and you get a ton of additional pleasure and enjoyment, I would say, from ruminating on this book with the aftertaste. So what could be a great companion to this book? Since The Loop is, as I said, about identity, it's about really understanding, or being able to understand even, what it means to be a human being unlike some other beings. What is their motivation? What do they want? And it's also about the topic of meta-predator. So it's the good old chain of food. So who's eating whom, or who's using whom for convenience or consumption? Humans are all the way through have been using other creatures. Sometimes even with those creatures oblivious that they are being used by a different species. So we do that. Who guarantees that there is no other species that does the same for us? Like the chickens we grow don't even know they are in captivity, because if they knew, they would probably maybe do something about it. And so they do from time to time. But that's the meaning of so what is one level of content in novels like this about entities of a different kind trying to use humans for their purposes. Here in The Loop, it is I would say a big mystery to unravel for the reader. And the mystery is, who is who in this whole arrangement that gets unfolding for you in this novel. Who is who and what means what. It's an interesting one to reread, because for me it started kind of dragging, because it kind of hit you with a lot of adventure stuff from the get-go. So you get, intense events going pretty much straight into the end of the first chapter, or I would say foreshadower. So once you're in the real action, it's dizzying. It's dizzying in a sense that it gives you so much food for thought for discovery of what's going on. So what would be a great companion novel for this kind of book? I would say it's The Blood Music by Greg Bear. And it's a novel about a similar thing where human identity, human mind and soul, and that's where the mystery usually begins in the novels like this, where the human identity would mix or try to enter into some kind of relations with a different identity other than humanity. And in this case, it's a scientist who cultivated his own microflora, his own microbes, and he wanted to cultivate smarter microorganisms who would be useful. He worked in a biological pharmaceutical giant, and he was a prominent researcher who has big budgets, enjoying the high life of a wealthy scientist who delivers state-of-the-art, cutting-edge technologies for biopharmaceutical industry. So, but he has experiments on the side for his own scientific, enjoyment and ego testing. So he goes into research into even smarter microorganisms who would be able to communicate with the human being somehow, chemically, biochemically. So he was keen on that idea to grow these kind of smart microbes who you could talk to, literally, like tell them like they are, as if they are part of your body, but they can accept verbal commands. So it's like you have suddenly a temperature rise, but you would say, all right, body, please normalize the temperature to so much, and then you give a value of degrees, and it just does that. Or if something's happening, it's like some problem in the body arises, we would not just, receive signals as late as they become painful when the tissues become inflamed or damaged, but we could potentially hear about the problem much earlier and would have done something about it if we could get verbal information from those areas of our body. And so he was cultivating these microbes, and he was obviously already a bit successful on that quest. So he had his own little experiment going on the side, and he kept in a sort of a climate controlled vault a culture of microorganisms that the management of the company should not better know about, because scientists wanted to keep that for himself, to enjoy the fruits of this labor he was holding it for his future career, not necessarily to give it to this company, for several reasons. And so, but one day the management of the company finds out that he's doing something on the side. He's doing some research. And so his friend gives him a signal, a warning that, you know what? There's a committee going to inspect your lab, and they'll be there in some 3 minutes. They were not supposed to inform you. They wanted to catch you unawares, but since you're my friend, I'm giving you a heads up. So they're coming your way. Whatever you're doing, if you're doing anything, so you have some kind of couple of minutes to hide it by. And so the scientist goes into a frenzy of, what am I doing? What am I going to do with this culture of microorganisms? If they discover them, so they will naturally destroy the whole thing. Or even worse, maybe get it for their own purposes. And so he decides to inject himself a syringe full of these microorganisms into his own body, which he does. And that's the beginning of the novel, actually. So then the consequences of his decisions start to unfold. And without spoilers, that means I'm not telling you anything, because everything is to savor in this book. But of course, you get the delivery on the promise that the scientist can actually invent or modify microorganisms without any electronics or nanobots. There's no nanotechnology in this. That's the beauty of this book. It doesn't use nanotechnology, and the writer Greg Bear, as it says in the preface, was consulted by scientists, actual biologists and geneticists, and they were able to proofread his concept, whether it's plausible or not. I mean, the writer wanted the concept to be plausible in the scientific discourse, so that the whole idea cannot be dismissed if you respect the scientific method. So Blood Music is a novel which is insanely wild in its imagination. It goes places that no cinema will ever reach, because you can't fit it on the screen, even if it's IMAX. The magnitude of and scope of things that events take in this book. So that's why it's better to keep this in literature, so that it serves as a programming code for your own imagination, which goes wild. Reading that as a code and builds worlds. So what could be a great companion to Blood Music by Greg Bear? I would say, and even earlier representative of this generation of writers. Let me get this. So this is Colin Wilson. Colin Wilson is considered a part of the classics of modern science fiction. So yeah, he's famous for science fiction and fantasy novels, or fantasy sci-fi. He has a big series of books, Spider-World, which is also a wild kind of speculative scientific fantasy concept, where spiders become the dominant species biologically, and so what happens. So but it's fantasy sci-fi. But he also has a book that it's the first book I read for him, and many people also get introduced into Colin Wilson and sci-fi as such through the book, which is called The Mind Parasites. The Mind Parasite is a book that it kind of reads like a documentary, maybe for a purpose, maybe it was intended so. It's like a documentary, some diary about the archaeologists who are on basic mission to do the dig and something in Egypt, I guess. So, although it starts telling about archaeology, it actually doesn't have to do anything with archaeology, because the actual plot starts to unveil on a completely different level, rather than what the characters are doing in their physical life, in their physical world. I would say it is like it's probably, I would say, as sometimes I've tried reading religious texts, and they sound like, maybe because of the age of the original texts or the distortions in the recording of the texts, but it reads so the Mind Parasites is like a modern proper version of the whole concept on which the Egyptian, Judeo-Christian, all these mysteries refer to, you know. But this time it's like stripped of all the fluff that was used to impress the public, the readership of that time, using just more interesting ideas and interesting ways to entertain these ideas. And that's how this book could read if it was written now. So The Mind Parasites is basically talking about a meta predator, as we said. All this sci-fi is about the food chain, that there is an entity or the host of entities that are much superior to humans, and they use humans for their own purposes. And this is where the wilder the fantasy would go into concepts that don't necessarily fit onto screen. What's great about this genre in staying specifically in literature, not going into cinema, although there are successful examples of that, let's say True Detective 1. But still predominantly, the most entertainment you get from these ideas is when you read them, not watch them on the screen, already rendered by someone's visual fantasy. When you render them by your own visual fantasy, and you render all the other things for yourself as a reader, you get much more real enjoyment out of it. So, anything else about this book would be a great spoiler, so I won't do that. Instead, I would recommend another interesting, but this time modern, weird fiction book, which is Bedfellow by Jeremy Shipp. And it's a gigantic, not in terms of size, but in terms of impact, novel. And it breaks a lot of ground, I would say, in terms of representation of what we would usually call an antagonist in a novel, in a setting like this. So it's all about changing your perspective on things like who could be the natural enemy for human beings and why. You know, it's like this joke. They ask the artificial intelligence, "Hey AI, is it true that the robots will enslave humanity?" And the AI just asks, "Why?" So why? What do we get from this? So humans are automatically thinking about a different intelligence as an enemy. So automatically we are in confrontation. That's what you get when you read a lot of speculation about the AI. It's like, whoa, we get another enemy to fight. Which, if you think about it a bit deeper, like, would be absurd for the AI to be wanting to actively destroy humans. That would be stupid. That's what humans would do, because they're driven by hormones, by two systems at the same time. One system of rules that people invent as part of their cognitive and verbal system, and another set of rules which is where the world of the body lives, you know, with signals, with electrical chemistry, with all kinds of stuff we know absolutely very little about. And we may claim to know a lot, but we don't. We do know a lot of applicable stuff. But so the books like Bedfellow entertain the idea of motivation. Why would human being have an adversary in nature, and what would that adversary do if it really did come to the and also it's a novel about mimicry, about this natural phenomenon where one creature learns to imitate the terrain or the behavior of other creatures, and develops that ability to such a great extent that it's harder for if it's a predator and the prey, so it's harder for the prey to even register the presence of a predator if the predator is so cunning and smart. And so the novels like this and go deep into the idea of a food chain and expand the motivation part of it a lot, plus working with your fantasy. This is literature where the writer Jeremy Shipp, like not so many great writers, uses readers' fantasy more than his own fantasy. So he gives you some codes to start with. He doesn't go on describing like a lot of writers do, all the visual components of what you should see. Like he came to the wall which was red, and then starts describing, like if it's a screenwriting, like if it's a screenplay for director to read and actors. So what's happening visually, but it's much greater a lot of times when the writer is not limited by just visual part of things, and he gives you codes to render, having this great rendering engine or fantasy. And so Bedfellow is a significant book in the modern weird fiction genre. It's a great companion to all those previous books that I've selected for this review. Of course, from Bedfellow, it's pretty high bar that we set with Bedfellow. I mean, to follow on a book so great is a challenge. But luckily, I've done some selection for you. And in case if you really enjoy Bedfellow, and if you're watching so far, you probably will, you would want to chase it down with something at least as good. And I would say I'd recommend this one for you. It's a book, Come Closer, by Sarah Gran. So, the general blurb for the book, squeezed in one sentence, wouldn't tell you a lot. So essentially it's about demon possession of a young woman. So a young woman develops a relationship, or, described in the ancient terms, got possessed by a demon. But it's not that simple. It's not that direct, if we would describe what happened in this book. So yeah, on one hand it is a demon possession, but there is so much more happening, and what it is that is happening, of which there is so much more, I would recommend you do a discover on your own, because that is so much better than than me retelling you the contents of this great book. I would also say that it's a very feminine book, because there's a lot of inner knowledge that I wouldn't say a man would properly know and know how to write about. At least it feels like that. Maybe it's subjective, but so it's an enormously great novel. And it's also about motivation. Why would there be a motivation for another entity to enslave a human being, like a toy? But that doesn't mean that this entity is so much advanced, because you can't stay a child eternally in terms of why you do stuff. And if you encounter a superior entity, but the motivation of that entity is still to play childish games, that is a cognitive dissonance. So these writers explore these kind of ideas. Why would a different entity want to have humans under their control? And why at all? And even more contemporary book on this topic, I would say, is Stonefish by Scott R. Jones. I mean, that is a heavy hitter. This is heavy artillery in terms of how strong this literature is. In terms of, again, the magnitude of concepts that this novel offers to you is incredible. Things to imagine and things to even challenge your imagination to imagine are, well, they are quite present in this book. I envy everybody who is going to read it for the first time, but it's also great for a reread. And then another thing about this kind of book, and there are several that I've read so far of this type, that it's very hard to put in words the plot once you have it read. It's such a strange plot that it doesn't lend itself to short recap what actually happens. But at the same time, there's so much meaning, there's so much profound discovery that you have within yourself as a feeling. So that is such a great success, I think, for a writer to create two separate streams of consciousness, at least, at almost two separate streams of what is happening. It's like a David Lynch movie. Like there's things that we see on the screen, and there's this feeling that something else is happening, that there's this another another tape that goes invisibly and also showing something. So that's the kind of feeling you get from a novel like Stonefish. So highly recommended. That's all I think I say. It's very much worth your attention if you are into this kind of genre. Well, of course, we can also mention the great old China Mieville, who also has a novel about an entity that kind of controls humanity, but again, it's unclear. Here it is unclear what's the motivation for that entity, because this is a almost comical in some sense, but a bizarro fantasy novel. So, because China Mieville is known for bizarre creations, bizarre pandemoniums and bestiariums, he made a specific point of going away from the cliche, going away from the established kind of narratives in fantasy, and he made a strong point to rediscover fantasy and to do it all from scratch, which he did. He did it in his first novel, King Rat. He did it in his trilogy of New Crobuzon. He immediately reached so high and achieved such a high level of literature that it was astounding. But this novel is his, let's say, next stage in development as a writer. I would say he made his prose much more concise, because he would previously go, he was wordy but quite forgivable for that, because the wordiness of China Mieville is usually well crafted. So it's not just wordiness like, oh man, you should cut this text. It was a text worth reading. But then he probably, I don't know, under the influence of editors or readers, I don't know, or himself, he decided to make his prose a bit more concise, so he kind of shrunk it a little bit down with every new novel. At least my feeling was like that. And this is where the idea of an octopus as an entity that has something to do with events of inhumanity is so bizarre. Things that are happening in this novel are just bizarre. They are completely out of proportion. And still you don't have the motivation. Why would this entity even control? Does it eat us? Well, obviously from this novel, no. It's a mystical creature that does stuff for mystical reasons, and that's basically it. But it's enjoyable. The novel is very enjoyable because it's very playful. He's like, China Mieville here is like a child. And he went on after this book and wrote several successful books for children and young adults. So I don't know a bad book from China Mieville, seriously. I haven't read his documentaries, the non-fiction about the Moscow Revolution or St. Petersburg or the Russia. I don't know. I haven't read it. But one of his most recent books, The New Paris, is quite deep, and I'm still kind of grappling with it. Here it is. Let me have it on display. So this book, it's just my screenshots from Kindle. That's why I'm so clumsy with it. So, Last Days of a New Paris is also a kind of a tale of the food chain, because entities are clashing between each other. but the reasons for their clash are so absurdist, and that's why I still don't understand it. And I've just discovered halfway through the novel that you should understand a little bit of abstract art, and abstract art in particularly after the Second World War and after the First World War. So abstract art, surrealist art as a remedy for collective trauma of war. So that was the idea for some cultural studies that China Miéville obviously has read or explored. And so he mixed it all together with his wild fantasy. He mixed it with abstract art, with surrealist art. And then when you know the names, at least, of artworks that are mentioned and brought alive in this novel, then hopefully, not for me yet, hopefully will burst into a different and bigger level of meaning. So I have enjoyed previous works of China Miéville much more, but maybe I still have to discover The Last Days of New Paris for myself, because it's very difficult. It's hard to read, but I'm sure that it's worth it. So anyway, and just as a small bonus, this is a weird fiction collection recently I've discovered by a writer from Hungary, but Hungarian writer writing in English. So Attila Veres is the name of the writer, and the collection is called The Black Maybe. And it's very good. It's a lot of food for thought, and it's mind-boggling in a lot of ways. And it's about weird agriculture. One of the best, in my mind, stories from this collection features fruit and vegetables, or something in between, which always has something alive in it. So a lot of interesting agricultural discoveries. So I would say there's a subgenre, folk horror, and this is one of its prominent representatives. Okay, so I think I'm gonna play a little bit just to test out the equipment. Maybe the equipment works. Here's another book that is worth mentioning in the regards of an entity trying to get through to humanity. The famous great British writer Mike John Harrison. And if you know that name, and if you're into weird fiction, you probably know that name. If you don't, I highly recommend reading anything by M. John Harrison. I got to read him first from China Mieville's recommendation when China published his reading lists and lists of recommended books. That's how I discovered M. John Harrison. And boy, was I not disappointed. So, the master of the sublime and the master of compact, small prose that does deliver so much content. Every phrase of M. John Harrison is like a lot of compressed matter that you unpacked and unravel what's inside. So basically, all the sentences of his prose are so feature-rich that you don't always register until you learn how to unpack his prose. And so that's why there are a lot of people for whom, judging from their feedback, his whole thing kind of flies over their head, or not over, under, whatever, but they don't get it. Because they are used, most readers are used, obviously, to writer kind of holding their hand, showing them, explaining them what it is, like Stephen King. He's giving you some mysteries, but he's like a kind father, like, okay, so I'm here. Right, so that's what happened, and you can always ask him for advice. So he's like this is not this kind of literature, not that kind of writer. This writer doesn't hold your hand. He offers you a lot of his hands and kind of plays what's on those hands. But whether you take it or not, that's your job. That's why, reading is, although I believe it's a superior, it's the highest form of entertainment for humans as they are right now. But it doesn't just let you in easily. It's not just consumption entertainment. So you have to add some of your own work, mind work. So if you're not ready to do that, reading is not for you. So this is the writer who he's like jam-packed capsules of code that get into your computer and then they get unpacked or archived, and there's so much in them. And that's what M. John Harrison does in this book, where basically, you have a feeling like you're reading about an alien invasion or invasion of something. But what it is, you can't point your finger and say, oh, that's the invader, or that's what the, it's very vague, and the beauty is in that vagueness. It's kind of it's the mastery of hints, of understatements. M. John Harrison is in a lot of ways stands counter to the modern entertainment paradigm, whose main shtick is the razzle-dazzle thing. It's just, okay, I'm tired of thinking how to entertain you, so here's the visual channel overload, like sensory overload. Let's throw so much on the screen, you don't have any option rather than just to succumb and fall prey to the trance of how many images we flash onto you. But so if your perception is so much dulled through this kind of constant bombardment, maybe you have to spend some time to get into M. John Harrison's prose. But once you're in, you've got so much rewards for your effort. So this is where after reading this book, you're like, for a month or even longer, it's always forever there. To enjoy this ride, you can always just remember or reread a couple of chapters afterwards, and it kind of sucks you in. So yeah, it's about some creatures maybe trying to get back where they once were. So maybe he's talking about the prehistoric life, or what humans call prehistoric life, so what happened before. Maybe it's the creatures trying to get back to those times where there was water on Earth, or something else. And who is gonna, if this is gonna be some work to add water on Earth, who's gonna do this? So this and the very first book I started this review, The Loop by Jeremy Robert Johnson, are highly recommended if you want really hard-hitting but not traumatic literature. Although The Loop has a lot of traumatic events. Jeremy Robert Johnson, he's like a Quentin Tarantino of modern weird fiction. He allows for such gratuitous violence in his books, but you kind of the whole thing is not ruined by it. It serves a purpose in the novel, or Jeremy Robert Johnson is much more violent than M. John Harrison, but M. John Harrison could also describe very violent things, but they happen like in a slow-mo or run through a strange filter, of things. So if you haven't read any of M. John Harrison, and if you're into sci-fi, there are several of his books that you'd like to read. One of them is the trilogy Light, which also explores the notion of entities that we cannot comprehend. Like, there are entities in the universe who left stuff for us, but nobody in a million years could have ever figured out what this stuff is, but it's there. The stuff is there, and they call it the broken physics. It's stuff that cancels whatever there is in the perceived universe and bends it to whatever will, and we don't know what the will is and who is doing what. And so that's how weird M. John Harrison is. And so he borrowed from some of the sci writers of the previous age, of the 70s and 60s and 50s even. Some of the Russian sci-fi writers gave those, also used those ideas of a higher entity leaving some trash for humans to, sort through with all the consequences involved. So he explores that idea, but much wider, with much more prospects and gravity and sophistication. In M. John Harrison's work, it's much more prominent than in any other writer. And it's top shelf prose. It's top literary talent. No exaggeration at all. There's another interesting modern horror sci-fi that is worth mentioning, and here it is in all its glory. Let me bring it out a little bit. And I think it's debut collection by a great contemporary horror and weird fiction writer. Her name is P.L. Macmillan. I guess she's from the US. So this is a collection of short stories, and they are groundbreaking. I'm telling you that. They are incredibly again, thought-provoking to the max, and they stand for so long with you once you read those stories. This is true, like cosmic horror, but more with the sci-fi element. If Laird Barron liked to mix detective and crime novels with cosmic horror, this lady likes to mix cosmic horror with cosmos related sci-fi. So the mixture is great. It's insanely successful in terms of being effective as a book, as every short story is worth rereading. So What Remains When the Stars Burn Out is a great sci-fi horror, cosmic horror collection. For those who like True Detective 1, this is a must-read. And the whole, modern universe of modern weird fiction. There's so much to discover, and it's much more rewarding than, let's say, a lot of what comes on the screen. The reading of weird fiction doesn't fail, it's just so powerful. So, what else? So there's also Nova Swing, but I'm still reading this novel by M. John Harrison. Also, is the second installment of a trilogy that is called Light, and it took me like 10 years or even more to get through most of them, because of how complex some of the things that M. John Harrison offers. It really took me some effort to get used to the ideas of M. John Harrison here, but once I did, I'm not sure. For now, I think I'm pretty much clear of what is what, or at least what M. John Harrison intended, and it doesn't prevent me from enjoying the book. I'm not enjoying it less once somewhere into the start of the second novel of this one, the Nova Swing, you get to understand, I think, to some 90 or 80% of what's happening. But boy, that's how, the amount of effort you spend on Harrison's books is worth double the enjoyment that you get from those efforts once you get the book. Once it gets into your mind, so to say. Alright, so that's probably it for this time. That was a little book review thing. And we were talking about modern weird fiction that entertains the idea of other entities using humanity as their tools, or their prey, or their subservient assistants. And a lot of the motivation in successful books, let's say, it's a successful book when the writer succeeds in making you imagine most of the stuff instead of the writer, and your imagination is probably potentially capable of rendering wonderful or different, so detailed stuff. So when you get this code, you build it for yourself. For now, and I'm gonna play some more music. Putting the books back on the screen, the ones we discussed. So that was it for this time. Thanks for watching, and I haven't checked the comments yet. I was busy doing this stuff. So